Here's something that makes absolutely no sense. Canada builds over 1.3 million cars every single year, from Chevrolet Silverado to Toyota RAV4s and Honda Civics. They roll off assembly lines in southern Ontario, some of the most advanced auto plants in the world. And yet, Canada doesn't have a single car brand of its own. Not one. Zero. Every car built here wears someone else's badge, American, Japanese, or European. And that's what makes this story so strange. Because Canada isn't short on what you'd need to build a car industry. Not even close. It has the raw materials most countries can only dream of. Nickel from Sudbury, aluminum from Quebec, copper from British Columbia, cobalt, lithium, and rare earths in the Canadian Shield. The same ingredients powering the global EV revolution. It has world-class engineers, reliable energy, and a highly skilled workforce. On paper, it has everything a country needs to build its own cars. So why doesn't it? What happened to a nation that once ranked as the second largest automaker on Earth? And why do all the cars built here still belong to someone else? This is the story of why Canada can't build its own cars. Let me take you back to 1918, where it all started. Canada's auto industry was booming. Over a dozen Canadian companies were building cars. McLaughlin, Brooks, Gray-Dort, Russell, Tudhope, Brockville Atlas, and more. These weren't small operations. McLaughlin Motor Car Company in Oshawa, Ontario, was producing thousands of cars per year. They were exporting to Britain and across the British Empire. By 1923, Canada was the second largest automaker in the world, behind only the United States. Think about that. Canada, with a population of about 9 million people at the time, was outproducing countries like Germany, France, and Britain. So what made this possible? First, geography gave Canada natural advantages. Proximity to the United States meant access to American technology, parts, and expertise. Many Canadian automakers started by licensing American designs or partnering with US companies. Access to the Great Lakes meant cheap water transportation for raw materials and finished vehicles. You could ship iron ore from Minnesota, build cars in Ontario, and move them through the Great Lakes and Canal system to markets across Canada and overseas. Second, the British Empire connection. Canada was part of the British Empire, which gave Canadian cars preferential access to markets in Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India. British Empire countries imposed high tariffs on American cars but gave Canadian cars favorable treatment. This created a massive export market. Third, government protection. Canada imposed tariffs on imported cars to protect domestic manufacturers. If you wanted to sell cars in Canada, you either paid the tariff or built them in Canada. This forced American companies like Ford and General Motors to open Canadian factories rather than just exporting from the US. For a brief moment, everything aligned. Canadian automakers had technology, markets, and protection. But then geography started to turn against them, because Canada had a fundamental problem that would eventually kill the entire industry: market size. Building cars requires enormous upfront investment: factories, tooling, supply chains, often hundreds of millions before a single sale. Here's the economic reality of car manufacturing. To make that investment worthwhile, you need scale. The more you produce, the cheaper each car becomes. That's the power of economies of scale. For example, if you build 10,000 cars a year, each might cost $30,000 to make. Build 500,000 and the cost can drop to $15,000 per car. Same vehicle, half the price. Now, here's where Canada faced a unique challenge. In the 1920s, Canada had around 9 million people, compared to 115 million in the United States. That meant Canadian automakers were competing with US giants producing for a market more than 10 times larger. Ford's factories in Detroit alone were building more cars than all of Canada's automakers combined. Geography added another layer of complexity. Canada's population wasn't concentrated in one region. It stretched thousands of miles, from the Maritimes to British Columbia, divided by the Canadian Shield, the prairies, and the Rockies. The entire Canadian market was about the size of one large American state, like New York. That made shipping parts and finished vehicles across the country costly and slow. It wasn't geography's fault. It's just the reality of building in a vast, sparsely populated country. Meanwhile, American factories could serve dense nearby markets at lower per-unit costs. Still, Canada had one powerful advantage: access to the British Empire. Because of the imperial preference system, Canadian-built cars could be sold duty-free across Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, a lifeline that kept factories running profitably. Until 1929. In October 1929, the stock market crashed and the world economy fell with it. Global trade suddenly freezes as countries raise protectionist tariffs. The British Empire markets that had sustained Canada's auto exports shrank. Britain began supporting its own automakers. Australia and others follow suit. At the same time all this was happening, the Canadian market collapsed. Unemployment soars past 25%, and only a few Canadians can afford new cars. For Canada's independent automakers, it's a perfect storm. Exports vanish, home demand dries up, and costs stay fixed. Meanwhile, American companies with deeper pockets and larger markets survived the downturn. One by one, Canada's pioneers disappeared. Gray-Dort wins down in 1925. Brooks Steam Motors tries to innovate and fails by 1929. By 1935, almost every independent Canadian automaker was gone. The survivors, like McLaughlin, the largest and most successful, acquired by General Motors in 1918 and became GM Canada. Russell, once a national symbol of craftsmanship, is absorbed before the decade ends. After World War II, Canada rebuilt its auto sector, but the same challenges remained: a small market, high costs, and dependence on exports. Tariffs protected jobs, but also raised prices. By the 1960s, Canada's auto trade deficit with the US had doubled to nearly $300 million. Then came the turning point: the Auto Pact of 1965. Or so we thought. The agreement was simple: eliminate tariffs between Canada and the US, but require automakers to maintain a certain level of production in Canada. It worked. Factories expanded, jobs grew, and Canada became an integral part of North America's auto network. But it also ended any chance of a uniquely Canadian car ever returning. From that point on, Canada no longer built its own brands. It built the world's. So let's say Canada wanted to build its own car brand today. Could it be done? Technically, yes. Canada has world-class engineers, advanced manufacturing, and a skilled workforce. But experts argue that building its own car company from scratch for the Canadian market is impractical for the following reasons. Problem 1. Market size. Canada has 40 million people. The United States has 335 million. To compete globally, you need to sell millions of cars per year. The entire Canadian market buys about 1.7 million new vehicles annually. That's not enough volume to achieve economies of scale. You'd have to export to survive. But exporting means competing with established brands that have decades of reputation, massive marketing budgets, and global dealer networks. Problem 2. Supply chains. Modern cars contain about 30,000 parts. Nobody makes all those parts themselves. You need a massive supply chain. The North American auto supply chain is integrated across the US, Canada, and Mexico. Parts cross borders multiple times during production. In case you're wondering what that actually looks like, here's one example. It begins in Warren, Michigan, where General Motors engineers design the transmissions and drivetrains used across dozens of North American models. Then the story moves north. In Saguenay, Quebec, massive hydro-powered smelters operated by Rio Tinto melt raw bauxite into aluminum ingots, the lifeblood of modern engines. Those ingots travel west by rail to St. Catharines, Ontario, home to one of GM's most advanced powertrain plants. There, the aluminum is cast, machined, and transformed into engines and transmissions, the mechanical heart of the car. When the vehicles are finished, they make the long trip back north, crossing the same border again, to be sold in Michigan and Illinois dealerships. But the journey doesn't stop there. From Ontario, these components are shipped nearly 2,000 miles south to Ramos Arizpe, Mexico, where they're installed into SUVs like the Chevrolet Equinox and GMC Terrain. One component, 3 countries. Designed in America, forged in Canada, assembled in Mexico, and sold back where it began. That's how tightly North America's auto industry is woven together, a single supply chain stretched across an entire continent. So starting a new Canadian car brand means either building your own supply chain from scratch, impossibly expensive, or integrating into the existing US-dominated supply chain and losing independence. Problem 3, geography and costs. Remember those refineries we talked about a couple of videos ago? If you haven't seen that video, you need to watch it. The title is Why Canada Can't Build Its Own Refineries. Because the same problem that stops Canada from refining its own oil also stops it from building its own cars. Canada's climate makes manufacturing more expensive, heating costs in winter, higher energy costs, construction delays due to weather, winterization of equipment. A factory in Ontario costs more to operate than an equivalent factory in Tennessee or Mexico. Problem 4, distance to markets. If you build cars in Canada, you're far from major markets. The US market is accessible, but you're competing with factories in Michigan, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mexico that are closer to population centers. European and Asian markets require expensive overseas shipping. Problem 5, currency. The Canadian dollar fluctuates against the US dollar. This creates uncertainty for pricing and profitability. When the Canadian dollar is strong, your exports become expensive. When it's weak, importing parts becomes expensive. Established automakers can hedge this risk. A startup can't. So what does Canada's auto industry actually look like today? Canada still builds cars, around 1.3 million every year, from the Ford F-150 in Oakville to the Toyota RAV4 in Cambridge, the Honda Civic in Alliston, and Chrysler Pacifica in Windsor. They're built in world-class factories by some of the most skilled workers anywhere, but every one of them wears someone else's badge. The profits flow outward, to Detroit, Tokyo, and Stuttgart. The designs are made elsewhere, and the decisions in foreign boardrooms. Canada builds cars. It just doesn't own the industry. Now, the race has changed, from engines to batteries. The Windsor assembly plant is being retooled for electric vehicles, though the model remains unnamed. Battery factories are rising across Ontario and Quebec, each one a bet on the future. But this new race isn't fought on equal ground. The US Inflation Reduction Act alone dwarfs anything Canada can offer. China dominates the entire EV supply chain, from rare earths to finished batteries. And Europe has its own state-backed industries. As Brian Kingston, president of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, puts it, the whole industry was designed around north-south integration. For a country of this size, building a fully domestic car industry would be extremely costly. Professor Peter Fries from the University of Windsor once tried to design a Canadian-made car. But when he approached manufacturers, the answer was clear. Absolutely impossible. We could never afford to do that. Even Australia, once proud of its own car companies, faced the same fate. When tariffs fell, the factories followed. And as Dennis Darby, CEO of Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, said, "It's just not practical to build a car company from scratch." The last person who did was Elon Musk, and he had billions. Still, Canada has shown what's possible. Project Aero, a fully electric concept car, reached 97% Canadian components. Proof that the talent and technology exist right here. But it's a prototype, not a production line. A spark of potential, without the scale to sustain it. Interestingly, this isn't the first time Canada has tried to stand on its own. There was the Bricklin SV1 in the 1970s, a bold sports car built in New Brunswick that collapsed after just 3,000 units. Then came the Zen Motor Company in Quebec in the 2000s, one of the first electric car startups in North America, gone within a few years. More recently, Electromechanica's Solo, a tiny three-wheeled EV, tried to find its niche but never reached sustainable production. The pattern is always the same: ambitious vision, early excitement, and then the same wall. small market, fierce competition, and brutal economics. Experts like Kingston and Darby argue that Canada must now look outside the north-south corridor, toward the east-west trade routes that connect it to Europe and Asia. Canada already has trade agreements with both. It just hasn't used them strategically. Because the truth is, as long as Canada's automotive future depends entirely on the United States, it will never truly belong to Canada. So here's the brutal truth about why Canada can't build its own cars. It's not about capability. Canadian engineers design components for vehicles sold worldwide. Canadian factories build some of the highest quality vehicles in North America. It's not about workers. Canadian auto workers are among the most skilled and productive in the world. It's about geography. Canada's market is too small to support domestic automakers at the scale needed to compete globally. Canada's population is too spread out to create efficient distribution networks. Canada's climate makes manufacturing more expensive than in competing regions. Canada's distance from major markets creates transportation disadvantages. And Canada's integration into the North American auto supply chain means any new Canadian brand would begin its life dependent on the very system it's trying to escape. Geography locked Canada into a north-south relationship that made perfect sense in the short term, but stripped away independence in the long run. Maybe the future lies east and west, toward Europe and Asia, where Canada could finally use its trade corridors to build something truly its own. Or maybe geography has already decided that Canada's role will always be building other people's dreams. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Can Canada ever break free from its geographic dependence on the US? Or is this simply the reality we're built into?